All right, everyone. Thank you again for joining us today. Our session is an Axiomatics bootcamp session on the basics of attribute-based access control. So today we have two of my favorite experts here at Axiomatics that will be speaking, Gerry Gebel and David Brossard. So let me introduce these guys to get us started. Gerry from Axiomatics, he is our president for Axiomatics Americas, where he is responsible for sales, customer support, marketing, and business development for the Americas region. Prior to Axiomatics, he was VP and Service Director for Burton Group's Identity Management Practice, where he also published reports on authorization, federation, access governance, user provisioning, and other IAM topics. Gerry has also been active in advancing the use of identity standards, having led interoperability projects for authorization, federation, and user-centric specifications. And then we have David Brossard. David joined Axiomatics in January of 2010 to focus on customer deployments and pre-sales. Previously, he had worked for 5 years at British Telecom in the United Kingdom in the Security Architecture Center. His main area of expertise is ABAC, SOA security, and governance. He has published several papers and contributed to several books on the topic of SOA security and governance. He holds a Master's of Engineering from the French National Institute of Applied Sciences, INSA Lyon. So you'll be in good hands with these two fellows. And with that, I will turn you over to get us started.
All right, thanks, Kelly. This is Gerry. I'll get things started here, and then David will chime in as he usually does. Welcome, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. Hopefully, what's that, David?
I will do.
Okay. Yeah, hopefully we won't have any technical difficulties here. It seems to be a number of those kinds of issues in the industry today, and hopefully the thunderstorms will not interfere with my power here at the house. So let's get started. So today we're doing an ABAC 101, so thinking of it as a university course. It's likely we'll do some more advanced ones, 201, 301, and so on in the future, to continue this theme. But for today's session, we wanted to go back to some of the basics and look at how to start approaching an ABAC deployment. So for our agenda today, we'll look a little bit do a little bit of a history lesson, look at memory lane, comparing identity-based, role-based, and attribute-based methods, go into a definition of what is ABAC, or attribute-based access control. Then David will take us through some of our technologies, what we call the 7 steps to ABAC success, and we'll look a little bit about how to apply this technology to APIs, to the Internet of Things, or to big data, and then talk about how you can get started right away. So the first part of our agenda here, strolling down memory lane and going to the next page, looking at identity-based access control. This is not really that common an acronym, but we do see it used from time to time. It's really about basing access control rules or definitions on who you are. So that's the primary factor, is who the user is. And some examples from the past are things like discretionary access control systems, or access control lists, or ACLs, or other permission-based systems where you essentially have a means of managing users, potentially grouping them together, but it's very user-focused or user-centric. And it's fine for small environments, for very simple environments, but as we'll see in a little bit here, it definitely had some issues with scaling to large populations. So in the early 90s, the role-based, or RBAC, convention came into play. And this is a method where we define roles, functional roles typically, and you try to assign permissions or entitlements to those roles. So the idea is that you can assign these roles to users, and they can have more than one. So in the banking environment, there might be a senior teller, or there might be an accounting clerk, or there might be a customer service person. So these are the roles, and then based on getting those assignments, they would get certain kinds of permissions. They can view customer records, or they can update accounts, or so on. And this has actually been formalized initially by NIST, the National Institute for Science and Technology, here in the U.S. But David, I think it's also an ANSI standard at this point as well. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I believe so. I believe you're right. Yeah.
So there's been a lot of academic research, a lot of papers written over the years about RBAC and role-based access control. Certainly the idea of it was to get more leverage over larger user populations, so you didn't have to manage individual users in your identity systems and define their access, but that you could do it at a role or a group-based level, so you could have more leverage over these larger populations. But of course, sorry, David, go ahead.
Yeah, also, I would say, Gerry, that it's been a model that's been very widely implemented in software solutions, be it end solutions or security solutions. So it's very well known, very well understood.
Absolutely, it's widely deployed today, even for new application development. But of course, as technology evolves, as business requirements change, we saw that those legacy models or existing models had some limitations or challenges, and largely it is around scaling to large populations. When you think of the population of the world and how it's growing, I think it's we see that in a lot of our own business interactions, where we have to deal with not just our own employees and contractors, but potentially a very large number of customers or outside parties. And with identity-based access control, it really does not scale well to those kind of environments. And also, it focuses just on letting you in the front door, not necessarily controlling what rooms or departments within the building that you can get to. And even with role-based or RBAC, for more complex environments, it definitely has some shortcomings. You can provide them access to an application, but it's difficult to really get down to the data level, and I think that's something, David, you'll expand on a little bit more later on. And it's hard. One thing that you don't have is the ability to determine access based on the policy language. So RBAC can end up with stale sets of permissions that you're not sure if they're actually being used or not. And the whole process of defining roles and different categories of roles and groups of permissions is a fairly lengthy process. And it's also difficult to interpret or enforce segregation of duty toxic combinations, and in fact RBAC can actually create them. So if I have a user, for example, that is authorized to both create invoices and to approve payment of invoices, but they just can't approve the ones they created, well, with a policy language like ABAC, we'll see that that's easily accommodated. But in role in an RBAC style system, it's very difficult to represent that kind of scenario. Is that what you've seen as well, David?
Absolutely, and I'd like to add as well that in the identity-based access control or the role-based access control models, you have to invent a lot of artificial artifacts to be able to express your access control, and the more role you engineer, the more permissions you create, the further away you are from the original access control intent, which makes it even harder to audit, even harder to understand and maintain as time goes by.
Right, and so what's the result? In many cases, we see organizations that end up defining more and more roles to try to get this, very specific separation of duty, or to accommodate other different kinds of business relationships, and you end up with the role explosion kind of scenario. And I commend you for finding the right kind of backdrop for this, David.
Thank you. You know my sense of humor, it's legendary.
Indeed it is. So all is not lost. There is help on the way here, and in the next section we'll transition to ABAC, or attribute-based access control, and talk about how it can help address some of the limitations of prior models, but you don't have to throw them out. This is an evolution where they both coexist quite well. So what is it about ABAC that allows it to work so well in today's environments? Well, it's because we live in a multidimensional world, and in access control it also takes on multiple dimensional characteristics. And if we look to the next slide, there's really this Venn diagram, if you will, of the identity about the users, the information or characteristics about the data we're trying to access, and then a lot of contextual information about when access is appropriate or when it should be denied. So this is what attribute-based access control allows you to do, is take all of this into consideration.
And if you relate this Venn back to IBAC, RBAC, and ABAC, Gerry, the blue circle, the identity circle, that's very much the identity-based access control. All you care about is who you are. And then, of course, when you start looking into the data, then you might need to introduce roles and groups, and that's the premises of RBAC. But of course, it's not enough, and then you want to introduce context, and that's where ABAC really helps you bring those three dimensions together into that sort of that Venn of identity, data, and context.
Absolutely. And on the next slide, we have a quote also from a paper from NIST that I think really captures that notion. Here, as they say, you can grant or deny user requests based on arbitrary attributes of the user, right? So that's the identity-based, but also arbitrary attributes of the object, and then any kind of environmental condition that may be globally recognized and more relevant to policies at hand. So it's really this combination that gives you the power of ABAC, because on the next slide, it's not just about who you are.
Actually, Gerry, sorry to jump in, but before you go to the next slide,
okay.
One more interesting item in that quote is grant or deny. So it's not just about permitting access or giving access, opening doors. IBAC and RBAC, they only give you access, they don't deny you access. ABAC will allow you to define negative rules, negative checks, and that's quite unique. That's a new possibility that opens up, ironically, opens up new worlds.
Well, that's an interesting point, right? Because, and I hadn't thought of it in that fashion before, but being able to deny rules that may be more efficient in managing access in certain environments than trying to define all of the permit rules, if you will.
Right, absolutely.
Very good. So then on to the next slide here. So what we're just saying is we can grant or deny that access based on any combination of attributes about who you are, what kind of device you're using, what's the time of day, where are you located, what's your relationship to the data, and how are you accessing this data. So these are, again, the building blocks of an attribute-based system, said slightly differently on the next slide here. It's very interesting, all the different combinations that are possible with an attribute-based model, because you can have a lot of information about the user, not just their role, but maybe their department, their cost center, their citizenship, their affiliation to a certain office, what information can they access. That can be based on their own direct relationship, but also it can be on the relationship of, say, the branch office or the hospital system that they're assigned to. The time of day can also be an important factor in certain scenarios, so this is something that also can be incorporated by the ABAC system. Where you are located is becoming more and more of an issue, and this comes up in cross-border privacy concerns, or it can just be that an organization wants to allow more access to data if you're on campus versus if you're dialed in remotely from somewhere. I think I just showed my age by saying dialed in. But also here, what kind of device? In a world of bring your own device, This also may be a factor that's important to the data custodian or data owner. That is, is it a device issued by the organization, or if it's a bring your own device, is it at least registered with us already? And then why? What is the reason for the access? Does the purpose of use match, the purpose of data capture from when the that information was originally collected? So all of these things can be incorporated and accommodated in an ABAC system.
And Gerry, I want to stress a word that you used on this slide, and that word was relationship. One of the key benefits, one of the key strengths of ABAC compared with role-based access control is the ability to naturally express relationships. And as you said, it could be direct relationships. For instance, a doctor cares for a patient, that's the direct care relationship. Or as you said, it could be an indirect relationship. A user can view a document because the document and the user belong to the same department. The ability to express relationships makes ABAC extremely powerful, and it makes it very easy actually to implement scenarios that otherwise would require dozens, if not hundreds, of roles.
And lots of lines of custom code as well.
Absolutely.
All right, so on this slide here, I wanted to revisit a thing I mentioned earlier. That is, we're not talking about replacing role-based or any other kind of access control system. And this was, I think, highlighted really well in a webinar we did recently with Kuppinger, which is an analyst firm based in Germany, where Martin Kuppinger talks about this continuum of going from RBAC to ABAC, and he describes different characteristics of each end of this spectrum. But what he also emphasizes is that you're going to transition away from roles and go straight to a perfectly attribute-based model, but rather there's some sweet spot here in the middle, and it's going to be different for each organization. But there's this notion that roles are, we call them a first-class attributes in an ABAC system. Roles are very important, but it's the fact that an attribute-based model can add so much additional context, to the scenarios while still accommodating simple cases as well as the more complex cases. Is that a fair summary of that, David?
It is indeed. It was. I recommend that attendees today turn to the webinar that Kuppinger organized, because there were a lot of very good nuggets on the transition from role-based access control to attribute-based access control.
Right, and we've got an archive of that, or a recording of that in our webinar archive, so you can find that on our website. Okay, so another way to describe some of the characteristics of an ABAC system, we think it's a very comprehensive approach to authorization. In the first case, it's externalized from the application or the business logic, so you can manage the maintenance of your application code independent of the maintenance of the access control rules and policies, and we see this being very valuable for many of our customers. Second is the notion of a centralized model here. Centralized from the perspective that you do have this external and central place to define authorization logic and manage it from that perspective, although in a physical deployment, of course, it can be very decentralized or distributed based on your operational requirements. Third is the policy-driven model. We've mentioned the policy aspect of an ABAC system a number of times here, and in the policies is where the access control or authorization logic is expressed. So it's like having a programming language for your access rules, and you manage and configure that again centrally or external from the applications. And then of course the attributes, because those are the building blocks used in the policies. That's why it's called attribute-based access control. So we think this is, as we say, a very comprehensive approach to consider. And if we look on the next slide, yes, David, did you have another comment here?
add one more point, more specifically on the third bullet here, the policy-driven authorization. The policies are what makes ABAC easy to understand, easy to audit, because the policies are very close to the original authorization or business requirements. So you've just removed and gotten rid of all this role engineering step that you had to do, and this very complex step of translating from business requirements into IT artifacts. Now the authorization and the authorization policies are in the hands of the business, and the IT artifacts, the policies, are very, very similar to the business requirements, which makes it easier to maintain, easier to audit.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think you'll be talking to that more during your 7 steps to success, because that's a good starting point for that. So talking more about that policy here and some of the competitive advantages that this ABAC model provides. Well, it more closely represents business logic than role, permission, profile kinds of structures, and I hope that comes out during your section, David. And the basis of these ABAC rules do go straight back to the business, or it could be to the regulatory office, to the legal office, or compliance, or privacy. So, for example, if there are restrictions about who can see data for Swiss bank customers or Singaporean bank customers, well, that does come from the business, or it comes from the compliance office, not from IT. And that's a very key point to make here. IT just implements the policies as they're derived from the business owners. And in our case, we use the exact MOL standard policy language to implement those policies. And David, as you just mentioned, now if we need to do audits on what can happen, who does have access to different resources, well, then we can just analyze the policies and determine the answers to those kinds of questions. And then for an ongoing maintenance perspective, if you need to add more context or a different kind of rule to the environment, well, you're not changing the application code, rather you're changing a policy definition, going through your testing harness, and then implementing that policy change, rather than re-implementing application logic or trying to re-engineer your role environment. So David, I think this is where you take over and start talking about these 7 steps to ABAC success.
Thanks, Gerry. And actually, I'll start off by saying that I don't know how to count, because there's only 6 steps in the process, but I wrote 7 all over the slides. So I think I need to go back to elementary school and learn how to count. With that said,
that got past all of the editorial reviews. That's not very good.
I know. It's just 7 is a lucky number, I guess. So the experience that we've had with our customers so far, and with the adoption of attribute-based access control, is that if you want to have a successful adoption of attribute-based access control, there is a life cycle that you can follow, and that life cycle starts very simply by gathering the authorization requirements. And that happens through a dialogue with the business, understanding what it is they want to do, understanding what the scope of their application or the scope of the service is, and understanding how that will be exposed or shared with consumers of that application. So it's very, very simple dialogues with the business that you want to have to gather those authorization requirements. And we'll have a look at a few examples in a minute. The next step down from that is identifying the building blocks or the required attributes. And again, based on the use case we'll be sharing in those slides, we'll look at what those attributes are and what they represent. And these are, I would say, the 2 most important steps. The quality of those 2 steps will determine the quality of the implementation. In a third step, you want to implement the policies using XACL, XACML, the standard for ABAC. Then eventually you test the policies, you deploy the policies, and finally you can run audit reports or access reviews. So this is, at a very high level, the ABAC lifecycle that you want to keep in mind when you're getting ready to implement attribute-based access control. So let's put that in context of a simple ABAC use case. Many of our customers want to expose some kind of portal, some kind of information to their consumers, and the consumers could be end customers, employees, contractors, it depends. So let's take, as an example, a web portal. And let's take the use case of user self-service. You want people to be enabled. You want people to actually do themselves whatever they need to do. You don't want them to go through a third-party entity. And the type of information we'll be dealing with is just a data record, any type of data record. And the actions, of course, you can do on those records, Gerry, would be manage, edit, delete, the typical actions you would do on any type of information. So more specifically, when we talk about ABAC and when we talk about attributes, we tend to put them into different boxes, into different functions. So you're going to have the users. Those users could be a manager, it could be an employee, it could be an administrator, it could be many types of users. And to your point, Gerry, you could add information about their department, their citizenship, their date of birth. That will be the subject of your access control. So they will fit into the subject category or the subject box in the ABAC world. And then, of course, those subjects, those users, they want to access something. There is a goal, there's an object to the access control within ABAC, and that object will be a medical record or an insurance claim or a financial transaction. It will be the target of the request. And again, with ABAC, you can describe those objects with as many attributes as you like. So it could be the type of record, medical record, insurance claims, so on and so forth. It could be the department of the record, the sensitivity of the record, the location of the record, whether that record is classified as export controlled, or whether it's classified as being highly sensitive. You can invent or you can use as many attributes as you like, and very often those attributes and the values for those attributes already exist within the enterprise. There's another category, of course, of attributes, which is the contextual information. You mentioned that earlier, Gerry, when you were comparing RBAC with ABAC. One of the aspects to ABAC that make it dynamic is the ability to use context. And when we say context, we mean information such as the location of the user, the type of device they're using. Considering your age, Gerry, you might have used a pager when you were younger. I heard there are small devices that
I'm afraid so. Yes.
Yeah, I've never seen one of those except in a museum. But it could also be the care relationship between the doctor, of course, and the patient. Now, let's get started in our life cycle and gather some authorization requirements. These can be very simple, and it can be an iterative process. You talk to the business and you gather requirements, and you keep digging, you keep searching, you collect those requirements, and you agree on them together. A very simple example here, a manager can view any record. Period. Okay, fine. We all understand that. That's the beauty of ABAC, is that the requirement makes sense, and it's very close to both what the business understands and what the IT will need to implement. Let's crank it up a notch, Gerry, and add a relationship. In this case, an indirect relationship. An employee can view a record in their own department, meaning an employee can view a record if the record belongs to the same department as the employee. Let's add yet another attribute to the mix. So far we used a role, manager, we used the object type, record, we used the action. Now we can also introduce an attribute that indicates whether the record is a final record or a draft record. And we end up with a requirement on the third bullet here. An employee can edit a record they own in draft mode. So we're introducing the notion of ownership, a direct relationship, and another attribute, the status of the record or the status of the document. And finally, let's have a slightly more complicated authorization requirement here. A manager can publish, so far so good, a role and an action, a record, the object, if the record is in final mode, we've already used that attribute before, and if it belongs to an employee below that manager. Now we're introducing hierarchies, a hierarchy between the user attempting the access, the publication in this case, and the employee who owns that document. So we can have hierarchical access control with ABAC. It's a very comprehensive model.
And another thing I wanted to emphasize here, David, is something you mentioned on the previous slide, that is that ABAC policies typically use attributes that are considered business metadata. So if you think of the attributes you've highlighted here, the department, an employee, a manager, whether a record is in draft or final mode, this is not IT entitlement data per se, right? This is more likely part of the regular daily business metadata that the organization is using. So your ABAC policies can consume that data directly. You don't need to create these separate IT-defined or IT-managed artifacts. And I think that's an additional benefit of an ABAC approach.
And that's a very good point, Gerry. And what it does is it leads to a lean enterprise because you don't need to create those artificial attributes. Therefore, you have fewer things to maintain and cleaner records at the end of the day. So it's a leaner and cleaner organization. So the next step in our process is to identify the required attributes. Now, based on the requirements that you have, this could be a relatively easy step, or this could be a slightly more complex step, depending on whether you have the information that you need. So what I like to tell our customers, Gerry, and you know that, is pull out the highlighter. It's the magic sentence. Pull out the highlighter and start highlighting the keywords. And if you can, have 4 different highlighters, 4 different colors, so you can highlight keywords that have a relationship or that belong to the same category together. So let's go ahead and start here. I'm going to highlight the word employee. That is going to be a role, a user role. And that information would typically come from an LDAP, a user directory, wherever you maintain that information. The principle in ABAC is that you're going to fetch the information from where it lives. Going back to what Gerry was saying, it's a business attribute that you want to use. And I'm going to put that in a category that I'll call the subject category. It's the function of the attribute within the sentence. Now I'm going to pull out a second highlighter, and I'm going to highlight the next keyword, and that's going to be view. And of course, we all understand that that represents the action ID, and that would be an attribute that would typically come from the application you're protecting. The application would send an authorization request and say, can Bob view a record number 123? The following attribute here is record. And record describes the type of item, the type of object that you want to protect. Are you dealing with a medical record, or are you dealing with an insurance claim, or a business transaction? You decide. And a fourth attribute here is department. And department, or rather own department, I should say, is an interesting one because it's not just a simple attribute. As a matter of fact, it's an attribute of a relationship. It's the relationship between the users department and the records department. So what you get to do here is actually rewrite the authorization requirement in terms of those 2 attributes. You're breaking down the authorization requirement into an authorization policy that uses the users department on the one hand and the record department on the other, and compares the 2 together. And of course, users department is a subject attribute, and the record department is a resource attribute or an object attribute. What do you think, Gerry? Does it look simple?
It looks simple so far.
All right. So what we're going to do here is we're going to actually do a bit of testing. We have a simple application that we can use to do a bit of ABAC simulation. And in that simulation, I'll be using some sample data. So here's a dump of my database. You can see on the left, I have 3 tables called users, managers, and roles. Those are attributes of my users. So you can see that I have a user called Alice, and she's in sales. Alice also happens to manage Bob. Alice also has 2 roles. She's both an employee and a manager. Great. At the same time, on the right-hand side, we have records, we have data. And that's what we're trying to protect. So here we have records, and they'll have a number going from 123 to 143. They all belong to a department. They all have an owner, and they all have a status. So based on those attributes and based on the policy that we have in place, we'll get different accesses. Either access is denied or access is allowed. But before we jump to the simple application, let's go ahead and implement our policy. So the way to write the authorization policy is to pull out the in our case, the Axiomatics authoring solution, and to write the policy. And that's a very simple step, because if you've broken down your policy correctly in the previous step, where you've identified all your building blocks, then it's pretty much child's play to actually implement the policy. And once implemented, the policy will look like the following. Here, you have a master policy, and that master policy contains 4 different rules, 4 different ways of getting access permitted. You can see that it's a granted access. There's a nice green tick here. This is a screenshot of our tool, by the way. And the first rule here says a manager can view any record. The second rule says an employee can view a record in their own department. You can see that the word here was cut off by the screenshot. Rule number 3, an employee can edit a record they own if it is in draft mode. And rule 4, a manager can publish a record if the record is in final mode and if it belongs to themselves or an employee they manage. So the text here, the description of the rules, corresponds directly to the original requirements we gathered. So let me bring up the interface so we can see what it looks like. And Gerry, you know this UI, you've seen it before. This is the services manager where we do all the policy management. And inside I have a long series of policies, and I can select the one I'm interested in, the package number 4, which is the one we're using today. And if I look at it, let me just get rid of the other ones. If I expand it, then we get the exact same thing as what we saw in the screenshot. Very simple. And if I click on any one of those rules, I'll be able to see the attributes that I'm using. So you can see here that I'm looking at the record, and only managers can do it, and they can only do the action view. It's quite simple. We can actually expand this to get a slightly better view. And you can see how our attributes were combined together. So a manager can view a record. Very simple. This is ABAC implemented in our tool. Great. So with this tooling, you can implement as many policies as you like, as many rules as you like. There's technically no limit, really, to how many policies and rules you can have in the solution. Before we go to the testing, let's go back to the slides and advance to the next step, which is actually testing the policies. When you test the policies, what you want to do is verify that they actually do implement the scenarios that you think they do. You want to test them for gap analysis. You want to test them for completeness. And you want to agree with the business what tests to run. The business should actually define the acceptance tests for your authorization policies. One neat way of testing is actually to send an authorization request. So let's go back to my browser, and let me open up a neat little tool that I have. Let me refresh it so we start from scratch. This is a nice little testing tool called the policy enforcement point. In the ABAC architecture, the policy enforcement point is the piece that protects your application. So here what I can do is go ahead and send different attributes. So I'm going to say that I'm Alice. Remember, she's in sales. She's a manager. And I'm going to ask whether she can view document 1, 2, 3. If I try that, I'm going to send a XAML request. And look at that below, I get a PDP response of permit, a nice green response. Great. If I sent a different action, say delete, and I sent a XAML request, what happens then? Access denied. If you think about the authorization requirements, we don't have any use case for delete. It's not defined, Gerry, therefore we will deny access. But the viewing was allowed because Alice is a manager and because managers are allowed to view any document. What do you think? Does that make sense?
Pretty simple and straightforward, but it aligns nicely with the original natural language statements of what managers can do, and you set up the policies, and then now we can actually see the results in a very simple tool. So it's nice to be able to close that loop, at least so far, the partial loop that we've created.
Absolutely. And speaking of closing the loop, we can carry on with that loop and move to deploy the policies. So deploying the policies is actually a very technical thing. It's or very simple technical step where you take your policies, you've tested them, you're happy with them, you commit them, you version them, you tag them, you treat your policies as if they were code to some degree, and then once you're ready, you can go ahead and push them to your production environments. And ABAC aligns extremely well with the different methodologies that you have there. Some of our customers run DTAP, develop, test, I forgot what the A stands for, and P is production. Some other customers use different...
Acceptance, I think.
Oh, thank you, accept, yes. I'll accept your answer, Gerry. Other customers use different methodologies. In our tooling, it's actually quite easy to deploy our policies with a single click. It makes it very easy to go ahead and, if I go back here, if I go to my domain management, to deploy a policy is simply to choose the domain you want to use, open it up, and then choose the set of policies you want to apply. So for instance, I could actually deploy a permittal policy. I could choose that. That, of course, will break my scenario. I could click apply. And now it's been pushed to the many different authorization services I have in my environment. Right now, I've only got one running. And if I go back to my little test tool and I send a XACML request, then I get permit, when in fact I should be getting deny according to the scenario. That's happened because I've deployed a permit-all policy that, of course, opens up everything. So everything becomes possible.
Well, and here I think is you're going to demonstrate the importance of having a change control process in place, because now you can roll back to a known valid state.
Correct.
And do that easily as well.
So there's different ways of doing it, but the easiest way you can do is just you go back to the ability to choose your policies and you scroll down to the package that we've deployed before, which was this one. You choose it, you deploy it, you go back to the little test tool, and you just send your XACML request again, and instantly you get access denied. And all the actions, Gerry, by the way, they've been logged, so we know what's happened. We know who deployed which policy and when, on the management side. And of course, all the accesses that were attempted on the operational side were also logged, so we know that Alice tried to delete a document.
Right, so if you need to do any kind of investigation, then all of that audit data is there as well.
Yes, and that ties in very well to the access review step, where in access review you want to check that on the management side, administrators are writing the right policies, administrators are defining the right attributes and defining the right configuration on the one hand, and on the other you want to verify that the authorization policies that you wrote grant the right level of access. So running access reviews has become easier because all you have to do is analyze those policies and understand what access they grant and when. And Gerry, you know what? We've just finished our 7-step in 6 steps. We're that efficient.
That's amazing.
I know.
Another benefit of ABAC, we cut out 1 step.
Indeed. If only the acronym had 1 letter less than RBAC. All right, so Gerry, I'd like to talk a bit more about how ABAC applies to common trends we see in the industry today, and more specifically, APIs, Internet of Things, or IoT, and big data.
Well, that brings up another interesting point, I think. It's an opportunity for architects within an organization to reevaluate their approaches for authorization and access control when you think of it in the context of these, what I call macro industry trends, 3 of which you've got here, but also you think about, cloud computing, which has been around for a while, and bring your own device, which I mentioned earlier. So it's an opportunity for you to reevaluate and say, well, do my legacy techniques, do they apply to these macro trends that are happening? So it's an opportunity to look at, well, does ABAC suit some of these use cases better than a role-based or identity-based access control method?
Right. So if we briefly look, I'm aware of time here, we're running a bit out of time and we want to leave some time for questions. What's the key takeaway for APIs is that they define a well-known contract and they enable rich exchanges of data, and that's a great business opportunity because now you can exchange a lot more information with a lot more people. At the same time, it's a risk because you want to make sure that you share only the right amount of information under the right circumstances with the right individuals, and this is where ABAC steps in very elegantly, Gerry, because we will be able to define policies that very carefully and very specifically define the right level of access control for the right messages, the right contracts, and the right circumstances.
Right, and also from an implementation perspective, this is a very lightweight implementation model. If you use an API gateway, this is a great integration point for us to connect with, because it's easy to configure those gateways to process access requests with the Axiomatics policy server in a low impact way. So it's not impacting your developers pretty much in any way for the most part, right? So that's an added benefit.
Correct. So it makes APIs, I would say, the best use case for ABAC.
One of the best cases.
One of the three. So moving on to the second one, Gerry, IoT, or Internet of Things, it's actually very similar to APIs. The difference, I would say, is that APIs tend to be user-to-business interactions, whereas this is more machine-to-machine, and the scale of it is much different from APIs. You're talking about millions, if not billions, of devices shortly, and of course, a huge number of transactions, huge number of messages being exchanged, and also, very importantly, a huge risk for privacy breaches. So the requirement for the right level of access control is even more acute, I would say, in Internet of Things than it is for APIs. What do you think, Gerry?
Well, it does have a number of different dimensions. You know, the home use, of course, is one that's talked about a lot, whether it's your appliances or your wearables. And you know, just being able to configure your own environment to know what devices should be in your domain versus keeping everything else out. And then from the privacy perspective, you know, who has access to all of this log data? Because who knows, I guess there's people that want to keep track of how many times I open my refrigerator door versus, you know, how many steps I take or how many stairs I climb during a day. So data like this is valuable to different audiences for different reasons. And but having the ability to control the release of that data, I think, is going to be important as we see more and more applications being created to manage IoT domains and environments, whether that's on a home use, a personal level, or within different business contexts. So I think this is where we'll see you know, the potential for ABAC to facilitate a lot of those you know, permit-deny parameters.
Right. Yeah, I'm expecting huge growth in that area as well, Gerry. And moving on to the third, but not least, use case for ABAC, and that's, of course, big data, or as a matter of fact, data of all sizes. And that comes from the fact that as our society grows and we become more digital, enterprises and businesses own more and more data about just about everything and everyone, their employees, their customers, their partners, data that can be analyzed and exploited to discover new trends, new patterns, new business opportunities. At the same time, Gerry, we have more and more regulations, more and more jurisdictions to deal with. Every day I talk to a different bank that brings up a different country where they have a new privacy regulation. A few months ago it was Singapore, and then it was Hong Kong, and then suddenly it was Jersey off the coast of England, and then it was the Isle of Man, and then no later than today someone mentioned Ecuador. So all these are regulations about who can view which data, which customer data, and under what circumstances, and in the light of privacy regulations. So all these regulations applied to big data require that you have the right level of access control, of fine-grained access control, should I say, on your data, and that's where ABAC will fit in very nicely.
It sure does, and we've seen in many cases where the penalties for non-compliance are becoming more and more severe. So this is, you know, between the carrot and the stick, this is definitely on the stick side of the equation, where you know, compliance again is forcing organizations to implement improved or more efficient access controls, and this is a perfect example of that.
Great, thanks, Gerry. And that brings us up to the very last slide. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Kelly or Gerry, are you fielding the questions?
Yeah, we can field the questions. So folks out there, if you have any questions or comments about what you've seen or heard so far, definitely reach out, and we'll take them here over the next few minutes. So here's a question that come in that you know, some companies claim to be attribute-based, but they're really role-based. And he was asking for some additional clarification of what differentiates ABAC from RBAC. And I would say, David, that it's really about the policy language behind an ABAC system. I mean, the name focuses on the attributes, but the attributes are the building blocks used in the policy language. And the XACML standard, the extensible access control markup language, is an example of an ABAC system. But of course, it does utilize roles as one of the attributes, one of the building blocks. So that's what I would say. What about you? What would you say as any other differentiators?
Yeah, I agree with you, Gerry, that the policy is the key difference. I think 6 months ago I would have said the key difference is the relationship. That to me used to be the one that mattered the most, but I think actually that policy comes first and then relationship. So the policy gives you the transparency, the ease of management, the ease of auditing, and then the relationship, because you simply cannot express relationships with roles. It's just impossible. And that's what leads to role explosions. And explosions are great in Hollywood movies, but they're not great in identity and access management. So
Not
it's
so much.
both policies and relationships.
Right. Very good. Okay. Here's a question that comes up pretty often, and this person asks how, if we can talk more about how you integrate ABAC functionality with existing applications. I think the API gateway was one example, but can you describe some other examples, David?
Absolutely. So the most common one, like you said, was the API gateway, where you can very easily integrate with products like Layer 7, Data Power, so on and so forth. Other examples are in the web application world, where you can integrate with web portals, and that was actually the use case here, quite simply by deploying the right level of filter or the right level of enforcement points. Other use cases include relational databases, quite simply. Databases like Microsoft SQL, Oracle, or DB2 or Teradata, and where you can deploy a policy enforcement point right in front of your database to filter and or mask or unmask or encrypt your data, either on a row level or a column level. This is actually a very interesting use case, because by protecting quite close to the database, by applying ABAC to the database directly or to the data inside that database, you protect at the best place, you avoid leakages, and also you benefit from what I like to call the umbrella effect, meaning that if you protect the database, all the applications that use that database indirectly benefit from ABAC, because they will only be able to see the entitled data.
Right. So the optimal way is to have no impact on the developer. So an API gateway or the database proxy is a great approach, right? Because in the database example, you don't change the application, you don't change the database.
Right.
But there are cases where the application developers may have to interact directly with an authorization API.
Yes, and that's actually, Gerry, just to show some simple code, this here is a basic HTML page, and if you just look at the source for the geeks in you out there, this is how you talk to the authorization API, those 10, 15 lines, quite simply. It's that simple to integrate.
Right, and with the latest profiles of XACML, you can actually do this with JSON and REST interfaces, right, instead of being stuck with XML and SOAP only.
Correct, and this here is actually a JSON REST example.
Mm-hmm. Exactly, okay.
Sorry, that was the geek in me, Gerry. Over to you.
I understand. I know you can't resist. All right, we have got time for maybe one other question. Otherwise, we'll thank you all very much for attending and look forward to seeing you on an upcoming webinar. We've got a number of them scheduled. You can find them on our events page at axiomatics.com.